Story number 1.
I never liked swimming pools. Not because I couldn't swim, I could. I'd been doing laps since I was 5. It was the artificiality of it, the forced sense of fun around what was essentially a big concrete box filled with chemically treated water. But when you're a broke university student and your cousin offers you a summer job as a night custodian at the community aquatic center, you don't get picky. The job was simple. I was to come in every evening after the last shift ended, around 10 p.m., and clean the locker rooms, power wash the tiles, skim the water, and check the chlorine levels. No lifeguard duties, just maintenance and peace. I liked the quiet. The center was located on the edge of our town, backed up against a nature preserve, and at night the surrounding area was dead silent except for crickets and the occasional hoot from an owl. It felt like the whole world turned its back when the doors locked. My cousin Tom was the assistant manager. He was the one who'd vouched for me and handed me the keys on my first day. "Just keep it clean," he'd said, half joking, "and don't talk to anyone who talks from the water." I laughed. "What?" He didn't repeat it, just smiled and turned back to his paperwork. The first week was fine. Routine, even. The pool closed at 10 p.m. sharp, and I'd show up at 10:15 to start my shift. I had a checklist I followed religiously: mop, spray, skim, test. Most nights I'd be done by midnight and out by 12:30. The only creepy part was the lighting, flickering fluorescents and dim yellow emergency bulbs that gave everything a washed-out hue. But that's just old building stuff. I started noticing the wet footprints by the third week. They were small, barefoot, and always appeared after I'd finished cleaning the locker room floors. The first time I thought maybe I'd missed a wet spot. But the second time, they were there again, leading from the edge of the pool to the back hallway that connected to the boiler room, the hallway that was always locked. I mentioned it to Tom. He gave me a tight smile and said, "Yeah, sometimes the pipes act up. Might be condensation or something. Don't worry about it." But I did worry. The more I paid attention, the more the footprints seemed deliberate, like someone walking slowly, barefoot, stopping midway and turning around. Once, I found them going in both directions, like they'd gone into the boiler hallway, then come back. I checked the doors. Still locked. The night it got worse started like any other. I had music in one earbud while I scrubbed down the benches in the locker room. Around 11:20, I went out to check the pool deck, and that's when I saw it, something floating in the deep end. I froze. From where I stood, it looked like hair. Long, black strands fanned out across the surface like seaweed. I thought maybe someone had left a wig or something in the water. Teen prank, maybe. But as I got closer, my chest tightened. There was a shape just beneath the surface, human. Still. I ran to the edge, heart hammering, and looked down. There was nothing. No hair. No shape. Just water and the soft whir of the circulation pump. I sat back on the deck, sweating, and tried to calm my nerves. I told myself I'd imagined it. Maybe a trick of the light, or a reflection from outside. But my hands were shaking as I finished the rest of my tasks that night. I left the center an hour early and didn't go back until the next evening. The next night, the pool lights wouldn't come on. Every other light in the building worked fine. But the underwater pool lights flickered, then stayed off, leaving the water looking like a black void. I called Tom and told him about it. He said maintenance would come by in the morning and not to worry. I was about to leave when I heard a splash. Not a small one, a full-body dive into the water. My blood ran cold. I ran to the pool deck, flashlight in hand, scanning the surface. Nothing. I checked the bathrooms, locker rooms, even the supply closet. Nothing. Then, as I stepped back onto the deck, I saw it again. Wet footprints, fresh, leading from the edge of the pool to the deep end, and they stopped at the edge like someone had walked there and just vanished. I don't know why I stayed after that. Maybe I didn't want to lose the job. Maybe I didn't want to seem weak in front of Tom. But from that night on, things escalated. I began hearing humming. A low, childlike hum off tune and quiet, echoing through the tiled corridors. It would start when I was furthest from the pool, usually in the back storage room, and grow louder as I moved closer. It always stopped when I reached the deck. Sometimes the skimmers would be running with the baskets removed, their contents dumped across the tiles: goggles, leaves, Band-Aids, a clump of long black hair. One night I saw her. I'd been in the boiler room checking the pressure levels when I glanced through the narrow window that looked out to the pool. She was standing on the far side, skin pale, swimsuit dripping, hair hanging straight down like black wires. She was looking directly at the window. I dropped the clipboard. When I looked again, she was gone. I confronted Tom the next day. "There's something wrong with that pool," I said. "I'm not crazy. I've seen someone." He sighed like he'd been waiting for this. "She was a swim student, years ago, drowned during an early morning practice. Coach turned his back for 10 seconds, though, and she was gone. They found her in the filter bay. No one could explain how she got in there. It was sealed." He leaned in. The parents settled quietly, but since then, strange things. Every few months, a staff member reports hearing voices or seeing someone. We never talk about it. Most people quit before it gets bad. I stared at him. "And you just keep the place open?" Tom shrugged. "What are we supposed to do? Close it down? Tell people it's haunted? No one would believe us." I quit that night, but it didn't end. I still dream about her. Always the same dream. She's floating just beneath the surface, eyes wide open, mouth moving like she's singing underwater. Sometimes, in the dream, I'm pulled in with her. The water closes over my head and I can't breathe. And I always wake up choking, my sheets soaked in sweat. Last winter, I drove past the aquatic center out of morbid curiosity. It was snowing and the parking lot was empty. I parked across the street and stared at the windows, glowing faintly from the lights inside. I saw her again, just for a second. Standing by the glass, her hand pressed against it, watching me. I don't go near pools anymore, not public ones, not hotel ones, not even friends' backyards. I haven't swum in years, and every time I hear a splash, I still look over my shoulder because I know what I saw, and I know she's still waiting for someone else to look away. Story the end.
Story number 2.
It was supposed to be a relaxing summer, the kind where you shake off the stress of the school year and spend evenings swimming laps just to feel the cool water wash away the noise of the day. I was 19, home from college, and had just started lifeguarding at the Hillside Community Pool. It was an old facility tucked between a row of rundown tennis courts and a rec center that had been shut for renovations since I was in middle school. No one ever really talked about the pool's history, and I never asked. I just liked the solitude of the late evening shift. My shift started at 5 p.m. and ended when the last lap swimmers left, which was usually around 9. After that, I'd close up, sweep the deck, lock the doors. Some nights I'd stay a bit longer, do a few laps alone in the still water. Something about swimming at night when the lights under the surface made everything glow in ghostly greens and blues. It felt like another world. Peaceful, at least at first. It began with small things. I'd sweep the far corner of the deck, and when I turned around, my keys, clipped firmly to my belt, would be gone. I'd find them in strange places like the drain of the kiddie pool or on the lifeguard chair. I chalked it up to distraction or forgetfulness. Once, I came back from the bathroom to find wet footprints leading from the pool to the locker rooms, though I was the only one still there, and I hadn't been in the water. Then there was the sound. It started one night in late June. I was finishing my final lap, surfaced at the deep end, and heard a splash behind me. I turned fast. Nothing. The pool was still. I swam to the edge and pulled myself out, dripping and suddenly cold despite the warm night. I walked the perimeter, checked the gates. Locked. The place was empty. But as I stood there, listening, I heard a laugh. A child's laugh, light, high-pitched, like someone playing. It echoed softly off the walls. Then it was gone. I didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? The next night, I brought headphones and played music as I cleaned up. I didn't want to hear anything. But the weirdness didn't stop. One night, I opened the pool and found one of the lounge chairs half submerged in the shallow end. Not like someone had tossed it in, but like it had been carried carefully to the edge and lowered in. The security footage wasn't helpful. The cameras had all glitched between 2:13 and 3:07 a.m. that night, showing only static. It wasn't the first time the cameras had blanked out. The head manager, Phil, blamed it on the outdated system. He said the place was due for a tech upgrade, and not to worry. But I noticed that he avoided being alone at the pool after hours. Then came July 10th. It was hot that day, brutally hot. Even by 9 p.m., the air was thick and heavy. I just finished locking the main gate and was about to shut the lights when I heard a splash, again from the deep end. My stomach dropped. I walked slowly to the edge and looked down. There was a shape underwater, dark and unmoving, maybe 6 or 7 feet below. I panicked and dove in, thinking someone had broken in and passed out underwater. As I swam down, the water felt colder than it ever had, like swimming through ice. I reached for the figure. It wasn't a person. It was a mannequin, a life-sized mannequin, dressed in a child's swimsuit. Its arms were outstretched, its face pale plastic, with wide blue eyes that stared blankly upward. I screamed and nearly swallowed a mouthful of water. I surfaced fast, hauled myself out, and stumbled backward on the deck. I kept my eyes on the deep end, but when I looked again, it was gone. The mannequin wasn't there. I didn't sleep that night. I told Phil the next morning. He gave me a strange look, then led me into the office and shut the door. "There's something you should know," he said. "But if I tell you, you can't repeat it. Not to staff. Not to anyone." I nodded. 10 years ago, he started, a little girl drowned during swim lessons. Her name was Molly. The name hit like a punch. I had heard that laugh. A little girl. It was early summer. The instructor turned away for just a second. They said, "She slipped into the deep end. No one noticed until it was too late. They pulled her out, tried CPR, didn't work. The whole pool was shut down for a month. Staff quit. Parents pulled their kids. It was bad." Why didn't anyone tell me? Phil gave a half shrug. Management figured it was history. No reason to scare off new hires. That night, I went back after hours, even though I wasn't scheduled. I had to know. I brought my phone, a flashlight, and a heavy feeling in my chest. I sat on the lifeguard chair and waited. The pool glowed beneath me, empty, still. The only sound was the hum of the overhead lights. I stayed for an hour. Nothing happened. Just when I was about to leave, I saw it. Ripples. The surface moved, just slightly. Then again. Then I heard a soft splash. I turned on the flashlight and aimed it at the deep end. There was a shadow in the water. I climbed down slowly, heart pounding, and walked to the edge. The water was perfectly clear, but the shadow didn't move. It hovered just beneath the surface. I whispered, "Molly?" The air shifted, grew heavier. The lights flickered. Then something cold brushed against my ankle. I jumped back, shining the light down. Nothing was there, but I could still feel it. Wet, small fingers like a child's brushing against me. I didn't go back for 3 days. I called out sick, said I had food poisoning. Phil didn't question it. But I couldn't stay away. I needed to understand what was happening. I started digging into records at the public library, searching old newspapers, community reports, anything that mentioned the pool. The story was worse than Phil had said. Molly wasn't the first. There had been 2 other drownings at Hillside Pool, both children, one in 1996 and one in 2002. Both incidents happened in July. Both involved children disappearing underwater during busy open swim sessions. The odd thing? Each time, there were no witnesses. People were around, lifeguards on duty, but no one saw the child go under. They just vanished and were found minutes later, floating, lifeless. I stopped sleeping. Every night I'd dream of water, murky, cold water, and small hands pulling me down. Sometimes I'd wake up gasping for air, feeling like I'd been submerged. Then, on July 19th, the anniversary of the first death, something happened that still makes my skin crawl. It was another late shift. I was back on duty, trying to pretend everything was fine. Around 8:45, the last swimmer left. I started closing up. As I swept the deck, I saw a little girl standing by the deep end. She wore a faded red swimsuit. Her hair hung in dripping clumps. Her skin was pale, almost bluish. She wasn't on the roster. She hadn't checked in. "Hey," I said, trying to sound calm. "Pool's closed." She didn't speak, just turned and dove into the water. No splash, just a clean, silent dive. I ran to the edge, expecting to see her swimming below, but the water was empty, crystal clear. I scanned every inch. No sign of her. Then I saw something rise to the surface, a hand, small, pale, fingers splayed, reaching. I didn't think. I dove in, tried to grab it, but as I got closer, it dissolved. Just gone. The water turned icy, and I felt something wrap around my leg. I screamed underwater, kicked hard, and surfaced. I climbed out as fast as I could, coughing, shivering. My ankle had red marks around it, finger-shaped bruises. That was my last shift. I quit the next morning, didn't give notice, didn't care about the paycheck, just wanted to be done. I don't go near pools now, not public ones, not private ones. not even kiddie pools. I've moved twice since then, but sometimes I still hear it. That laugh, light, playful, echoing from nowhere. And once, I swear, I came home to find a puddle on the floor of my apartment, perfectly round, as if someone had just climbed out of a pool and stood there, dripping. There's no explaining it. I don't try anymore. I just know that sometimes when water sits still too long, it remembers, and sometimes it waits. Story the end.
Story number 3.
I grew up in a small town in Northern California, a place where everyone knew everyone's name. We had only one public pool, an old rectangular pool that had been there since the early 60s. It was the centerpiece of our summers. Hot afternoons spent floating on the surface, diving for coins, playing Marco Polo, and dealing with the occasional argument between kids over the diving board. But as much as it was a symbol of the neighborhood's joy, it was also the place where something happened that no one ever talked about. The kind of thing that people either forgot or tried to explain away, but I couldn't. Not after I saw it for myself. It was the summer of 2003 when things began to change. I had just turned 17 and spent every afternoon at the pool with my friends. The staff was mostly made up of lifeguards who were teenagers like me, so there was an air of casual fun about the whole place. I had a small job there as a concession stand worker, which meant I spent most of my shifts inside the tiny airless snack bar, selling candy, chips, and soda to the kids who were constantly in and out of the water. It was an easy gig, but I never liked being cooped up in the stand for too long, so I would sneak out when I could, taking in the sun or sitting by the poolside. One afternoon in July, the temperature hit the high 90s, and the pool was packed. It was so crowded that we had to limit the number of people allowed in at a time, which was a rarity for our small-town pool. But even with all the commotion, there was something off that day, an almost palpable unease in the air. It was like the whole world was too still. People swam, laughed, and shouted, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just out of sight. It wasn't until later that evening, when the sun started to dip below the horizon, that the strange things began to happen. The pool was closed at 9 p.m. every night, and usually we'd all start packing up by 8:30 or so. On this particular evening, the place cleared out early, with most of the kids gone by 8. The remaining few were just hanging out on the deck, drying off and having last-minute conversations before heading home. There was a low hum from the pool's filtration system, and the lights around the edge flickered just slightly, but it was nothing unusual. I had just finished cleaning the snack bar and stepped out into the warm evening air when I noticed one of the lifeguards, Jeff, standing near the edge of the deep end, staring down into the water. Jeff was in his mid-20s, tall, muscular, and usually carefree. But tonight, he looked pale. His hands were gripping the rail, and his eyes were fixed on the pool as if he was waiting for something to emerge. "Hey, Jeff," I called, trying to shake him out of his trance. "What's up?" He didn't answer immediately, just continued to stare at the water. I walked over to him, feeling the tension building between us like static in the air. "You all right?" I asked again. Finally, he turned to me. His face was drawn, his lips tight. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I frowned. "Hear what?" "Splashing, like someone diving in." I looked around, but the pool was empty, except for the two of us. The few stragglers had already left. The water was still and undisturbed. "I didn't hear anything," I said. "It's probably just the wind or something." But Jeff shook his head, his eyes wide with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe? It wasn't like the wind. It sounded different, like it came from underneath the surface. I glanced down at the pool. The water was dark, reflecting the few lights around the deck, but there was nothing moving in the water. "Maybe you're just tired," I said, trying to brush it off. "You've been here all day." He didn't respond. Instead, he stepped back from the edge and started walking toward the gate. "I'm leaving," he said. "There's something wrong with this place tonight." I watched him go, still unsure of what to make of his behavior, but I had a weird feeling in my gut, like something wasn't quite right. I lingered by the pool for a few minutes, thinking maybe I'd just get a few more minutes of peace before closing time. But that's when I heard it. A splash, a soft, subtle sound, like someone was diving into the deep end. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, looking at the water. The surface was still, but I knew what I had heard. It was faint, almost distant, but unmistakable. I stood there for a moment, wondering if I had imagined it. But then there was another sound, this time louder. It came from directly beneath the surface, as if someone was swimming under the water but not surfacing. I felt my skin go cold. I had heard enough ghost stories to know when to trust my instincts. I stepped away from the edge and began to head back toward the office, my mind racing. But as I turned the corner of the building, I heard it again. Only this time, it wasn't just a splash. It was the sound of something moving, like a dragging noise, slow and deliberate, just beneath the water. I glanced back at the pool, but the lights on the deck were flickering again. I could barely make out the shape of the water, now a deep, inky black. And then, as I watched, I saw it. A figure. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. But no, there was someone there. A person, floating, face down, in the deep end. I gasped and ran back to the poolside. My heart was racing, but when I reached the edge, there was nothing there. The water was still again, as if the figure had never existed. My hands were shaking as I stepped back. I wanted to call for help, but I couldn't move. Something held me there, a cold dread settling over me. I couldn't bring myself to look away from the water, as if I were waiting for it to happen again. It was then that I saw it, a shadow moving beneath the water, drifting toward the shallow end. It was unmistakable this time, the shape of a person, only distorted. Its limbs bent at odd angles, and its head turned in unnatural ways, as though it were struggling beneath the surface. Without thinking, I grabbed the nearest lifeguard tube and dove in. The water was freezing, and the chlorine burned my eyes. I kicked and swam toward the center of the pool, but when I reached the deep end, there was nothing. The water was calm again. No sign of the figure, no splashing, nothing. I climbed out of the pool, my breath ragged, my chest tight. I looked around for anyone else, but the pool was empty. There were no other lifeguards, no residents lingering by the gate. The only sound was the hum of the filtration system. I went inside to find the others. The lights were out, and the place was quiet. I searched the building and called out for anyone, but there was no answer. The place felt wrong, heavy with silence. I felt as though something was watching me. That night, I went home, but I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that figure in the water, the twisted limbs, the pale face staring up at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was waiting at the bottom of the pool, trapped, unable to escape. The next day, I found out that Jeff had quit. He'd left early in the morning, just like he said he would, and never came back. No one knew why. When I asked around, the other lifeguards mentioned that he'd been acting strange for the last few days. They said he'd started talking about hearing voices in the water and feeling something cold touch him when he was alone in the pool area. They just assumed he had a breakdown or was imagining things. But I knew better. I never went back to the pool after that summer. The complex closed it down shortly after, citing maintenance issues, but I heard rumors that it had something to do with strange accidents and the deaths of a few residents over the years. No one ever confirmed it, but the stories stuck. I still drive by the old pool sometimes when I visit my hometown. The gates are rusted, the water a stagnant green. I wonder if the thing I saw in the deep end is still down there, waiting for someone else to hear the splashing. And every time I drive past, I can't help but feel the cold touch on the back of my neck, like someone is watching from beneath the surface. Story. The end.
Story number 4.
It was the summer after my first year of college when I took up a job as a lifeguard at a local pool. The pool itself wasn't anything special. It was a simple rectangular community pool located at the edge of town, a place that locals frequented during the hotter months. The facility had been there for as long as I could remember. The building was made of worn brick, and the pool itself was edged with cracked concrete, the surface slightly discolored from years of use. Despite the signs of age, it was still one of the best places to spend the hot summer days, which was why I was excited to work there. I was assigned to work the evening shift from 4 p.m. until closing at 10. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it paid enough to cover my summer expenses. Most of the time, it was uneventful. Children playing, teenagers lounging around, families splashing in the shallow end. But there were some days when things didn't feel quite right. It was about 2 weeks into my shift when I first noticed something unusual. I was sitting in my lifeguard chair, scanning the water for any potential danger, when I saw a movement in the deep end. I had always been extra cautious, checking the deep end regularly since it was more difficult to see what was happening down there. But this time, it wasn't just a swimmer. I thought I saw a figure in the water. It wasn't someone swimming. It was like someone was standing there. I squinted trying to make out the figure. It was too dark to be sure, and the murky water didn't help. I stood up, leaning forward in my chair to get a better look, but as soon as I blinked, the figure was gone. There was no splash, no sound. The water was perfectly still. I told myself I must have been imagining things. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe the ripples had fooled me. It was a hot day, and my mind was probably playing tricks on me. But still, the image lingered in my mind. The idea that someone could be standing in the water, unmoving, felt wrong somehow. That night, I went home feeling uneasy, but I shrugged it off. The next few days were normal, until the evening shift again. This time, there were fewer people at the pool, and it felt quieter than usual. The sun was just starting to set when a family left, leaving only a few people behind. A group of teenagers had gathered at the shallow end, and I was grateful for the quiet. I had just settled back into my chair when I saw her. At first, I thought it was just another swimmer, but then I noticed something strange. She was in the deep end, and she wasn't moving. She wasn't floating either, but standing still, her head just above the water. Her body was eerily still, as if she were waiting for something. I didn't recognize her. She wasn't one of the regulars, and there was no one else in the pool that time of day who would have been in the deep end. I instinctively stood up, my eyes locked on her figure. I called out to her, asking if she was okay. No response. I started to climb down the ladder to go check on her, but when I looked again, she was gone. The water was perfectly still, just as it had been before. I quickly scanned the entire pool, my heart racing. There was no one there. I had to shake my head, trying to convince myself I was just tired again. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next day, the same thing happened. This time, I was more prepared. I stood up immediately, my eyes searching for the figure in the deep end. There was no one there. But then I noticed something even more unsettling. The water had a strange clarity to it, almost as if the bottom was more visible than usual. I squinted into the dim light, trying to make out the outlines of the pool's tiles. It was hard to describe, but it felt as though the water was holding a secret that it didn't want anyone to uncover. I tried to push the thought out of my mind and focused on my duties, but as the evening wore on, I began to feel more and more uncomfortable. It wasn't just the strange sightings. There was something about the atmosphere that felt off, like a heavy, oppressive weight pressing down on me. I began to feel as though I was being watched, even when no one was around. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling. I stayed late to close the pool, turning off the lights and locking up for the night. As I was walking out of the building, I heard something, a splash, a faint sound of water moving. I froze in place. It couldn't be. There was no one else in the pool. I turned back, my heart pounding, but when I looked inside, everything was still. That's when I heard a voice. It was soft, almost a whisper, but it came from the pool itself. "Help me." I couldn't make out the rest, but it was enough to send chills down my spine. I rushed back into the building, but there was no sign of anyone. No splash, no movement. The pool was silent once more. That night I went home feeling more unsettled than ever. I couldn't sleep, tossing and turning in bed, thinking about what had happened. The voice, the figure, the odd feeling that had been hanging in the air. It all felt connected, as if something had been trying to reach out to me, trying to warn me about something that I couldn't quite understand. The following day, I went back to work, determined to get through my shift without letting my fears get the best of me. But as soon as I arrived, I knew something had changed. The air felt thick, heavier than before. The pool looked different, almost as though it were darker, the water more opaque. And then I saw her again. She was standing in the deep end, just like before, her hair floating around her face. But this time she was facing me, her eyes locked onto mine. There was a coldness to her gaze that sent a chill through my entire body. I couldn't look away, even though every instinct was telling me to leave. The woman didn't speak. She didn't move. She just stood there staring at me, her face expressionless. And then, with no warning, she sank beneath the surface, disappearing into the dark depths of the pool. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. I couldn't look away from the water, even though every fiber of my being screamed at me to run. I finally snapped out of it and rushed to the deep end, my hands shaking as I leaned over the side, scanning the water. But there was no sign of the woman. No bubbles, no movement. The water was still, as if nothing had happened at all. I don't remember much of the rest of my shift. I kept my eyes on the pool, unable to focus on anything else. The feeling of being watched didn't leave me, and I kept hearing whispers, faint but persistent, calling out to me from beneath the surface. I couldn't get the image of the woman out of my head, and I couldn't stop hearing her voice in the back of my mind. That night, I went to bed early, exhausted and emotionally drained. I closed my eyes, hoping that sleep would provide some relief. But as I lay there, I heard it again, the faint sound of water splashing. It was quiet at first, but it grew louder, closer, until it was right outside my window. I jumped out of bed and ran to the window, but there was nothing there. The night was still and silent. But then I looked down at the street and saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure standing by the pool's fence, staring up at my window. It was her. The same woman. The same cold, lifeless eyes. I didn't know what to do. I ran out of the house, jumped into my car, and drove straight to the pool. I had to know what was going on, what this woman wanted, why she was haunting me. When I arrived, the gates were locked, the pool covered for the night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I walked toward the deep end, unable to stop myself, as though some force was pulling me forward. I stood there for a long time, staring at the black, still water. That's when I heard it again. Help me. The voice was louder this time, clearer. It was coming from the pool. I looked into the water, and this time I saw her, standing at the bottom of the deep end, her eyes wide open, her mouth moving as if trying to say something. I couldn't hear her words, but I knew what she was asking for. She was begging for help. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't help her. I couldn't save her. And as I stood there, staring into the dark water, I realized something terrifying. I had been drawn to the pool for a reason. The woman wasn't trying to drown me, but she was trying to get my attention. She wanted me to know her story, to know that she had died here, forgotten, and alone. I don't work there anymore. I left that job the next week, and I haven't set foot near that pool since. The woman still visits me in my dreams sometimes, her eyes pleading with me for something I can't give her. But I know now that she's not trying to hurt me. She just wants to be remembered. Story the end.
Story number 5.
I had always enjoyed working with children. For a while, I was a lifeguard at a local community center. The pay wasn't great, but the hours were flexible, and I liked the sense of responsibility. Plus, I was comfortable in the water. I had grown up swimming in the town's public pool, so it felt like a natural progression for me to take on a job that revolved around it. The town pool was large, probably too large for a small town, but it had been there for decades. When I started working there, it was already showing signs of age. The tiles had long since lost their original bright blue, and the lights in the changing rooms flickered every now and then. I'd hear the hum of the pool's filtration system, the echo of footsteps against the tiles, and the occasional loud splashes from kids who didn't yet know how to swim properly. But the place always had a comforting, predictable rhythm. That changed the night I saw something in the pool. It was late after most of the regular swim classes had finished for the day. I had just finished cleaning up the locker rooms and was about to start my final walk around the pool to make sure everything was in order before locking up. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. The pool had a set of underwater lights that cast an eerie glow, and when I glanced toward the deep end, I noticed something floating in the water. The light was dim, and the shadows were playing tricks, but it looked like a figure, just barely visible beneath the surface. The shape was faint, but I could see a distinct outline. I figured it was probably just a pool toy or some debris that had drifted into the water. But then I realized the pool had been emptied of all the floats and kickboards a long time ago. No one was in the pool. I'd made sure of that before cleaning the locker rooms. I peered closer. I wasn't sure if I was imagining things, but there was definitely something moving under the water. A ripple spread outward from the object, as if it was slowly sinking deeper. My heart started to race as I stepped closer to the edge of the pool. I called out, my voice trembling a little, "Is someone there?" There was no answer. I waited for what felt like an eternity, my eyes locked on the spot where the figure had been. Nothing. The water had become still again, and the figure was gone. Maybe I had just been working too hard. Maybe I was just tired. But the air around me felt thick with unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that something was still there. I checked the pool deck one more time, just to be sure, but I didn't see anyone. I finished my tasks and locked up the pool area, but my mind couldn't let go of what I had seen. The rest of the night felt like a blur, and when I finally got home, I tossed and turned in bed, my mind racing with thoughts of that strange figure. The next day, I tried to push it out of my mind. I chalked it up to exhaustion and the low lighting in the pool area, but that didn't stop me from being a little on edge whenever I passed the pool, especially when I went to work that evening. When I arrived at the center for my evening shift, I was greeted by a fresh sense of unease. I had become a little more cautious in my approach, but I didn't let myself linger too long over the things I'd seen the previous night. The routine helped me focus. The night was just like any other, quiet with the usual group of children finishing up their swim classes. I made my rounds, double-checked the bathrooms, and wiped down the pool deck. It wasn't until the late shift when I had to do the final rounds that I started to feel it again. That same sense of something being off, a creeping dread that curled at the back of my mind. I had been down by the deep end, checking the skimmers, when I heard a faint sound, like a soft splash. I froze. At first, I thought it was just a sound echoing through the building, but then it came again, closer this time. A light ripple in the water. My heart skipped a beat, and I took a hesitant step closer to the edge. The pool was still empty, or at least I thought it was. The lights in the deep end were dim, casting everything in a cold, bluish glow. I couldn't see the bottom clearly, but it looked like there was something beneath the surface. Something that didn't belong. I shined my flashlight into the water. For a moment, I thought I saw something move, just a flicker of something in the murky depths. Then the water went still again. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. "Is someone there?" No response. But I was sure I'd seen something this time. A shape. Or maybe it was the light playing tricks on me again. My hands gripped the railing as I leaned over the pool, trying to get a better look. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I didn't like the feeling that was creeping up my spine. Something wasn't right. That's when I saw her again, the figure in the pool. At first, it was just a blur in the water, like a shadow moving under the surface. But then, as if she was rising from the depths, I saw her clearly. A young girl. Her hair was floating around her head like black seaweed, her body motionless, but her eyes were wide open, staring at me from beneath the water. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move. I just stared at her, unable to look away. She wasn't struggling, wasn't swimming. She was just floating, staring. Her pale face and limp hair twisted by the water made her look almost unnatural. I finally managed to tear my eyes away from her, but the sight of her face was burned into my mind. I backed away slowly, trying to breathe, my pulse racing. I could hear the faintest sound again, just beneath the surface of the water, a soft, gurgling sound like someone trying to speak through the liquid. "Please," the voice whispered. "Help me." I ran. I didn't even look back, just bolted from the pool deck and didn't stop until I was out the door, into the parking lot and in my car. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, but I didn't care. I drove straight home, slammed the door behind me, and collapsed onto the couch. My mind couldn't process what I'd just seen. My mind didn't want to process it. The next day, I returned to work, determined to face whatever it was I'd seen. But when I arrived at the pool, everything seemed normal again. The pool was empty, the water calm. There were no eerie figures or ghostly whispers. The lights in the pool were working fine, and nothing seemed out of place. Tom was there, and I pulled him aside to tell him everything. He listened quietly, his face growing serious. I know, he said softly. I've seen her too. I stared at him in disbelief. She died here, he continued. A long time ago, she was one of the regulars, a young girl. She drowned in the deep end during a swim practice. The lifeguard couldn't get to her in time. Ever since then, people have been seeing her, usually after hours. I swallowed hard. Why didn't you tell me? He shrugged. I didn't want to scare you. Most people quit when they see her. But if you really want to know, I guess it's part of the job. She doesn't hurt anyone. She just watches. After that conversation, I never returned to the pool. I quit the next day and haven't been back since. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers. And when I close my eyes, I see her, floating in the water, her eyes wide and unblinking. Story, the end.
Story number 6.
It was the summer of 2010, and I had just finished my first year of college. I was home for the break, and for the most part, it was supposed to be a typical summer in our sleepy little town. My family lived in a modest suburban neighborhood, and our house was only a few blocks away from the local community pool. The pool had been there for decades, long before I was born, and over the years it had become a central hub for the community. In the hot summer months, kids would swim there all day, adults would lounge on the grass, and families would gather for barbecues. It was an innocent, idyllic place in every way, until one night. I was working at a local diner that summer, and my shifts would often end late, around midnight or so. Most nights, after I got off, I'd walk down the street to the pool, which was always open for a few hours after hours, though officially closed to the public. It was a habit that started when I was young. The pool was only a few blocks away from my house, and I'd sometimes sneak in at night to cool off after work. The security guard who patrolled the area never really seemed to care. As long as we didn't cause trouble, he'd let us swim after hours. It was an unwritten rule that most of the regulars knew, and it was always a relief to get into that cool water after a long shift in the diner. One night in late June, I was walking to the pool after closing up the diner. The night was quiet and warm, with a slight breeze that made the trees rustle along the street. The sky was cloudless, and the full moon cast a silver glow across the neighborhood. As I approached the pool, I noticed that there were no other cars in the parking lot. This was unusual. Usually there would be at least a few other people who had the same idea. I thought maybe they had all gotten tired of swimming early. I pushed open the gate to the pool area, and the familiar scent of chlorine hit me like a wave. The pool itself was eerily still, its water shimmering under the moonlight. The lights along the poolside flickered a bit, casting long shadows across the concrete. It was quiet, too quiet. No music, no voices, just the hum of the pool's filter system in the background. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just a slow night, and made my way to the changing rooms to get into my swimsuit. The locker room was empty, the lockers all silent. As I changed, I felt a strange sense of unease creeping in, though I couldn't pinpoint why. I had been to this pool 100 times before, usually at night, and it had never bothered me. But tonight, the air felt thick, and the silence was unsettling. When I emerged from the locker room and walked toward the pool, I noticed something strange. The water, which usually sparkled in the moonlight, now looked darker, almost as if it had taken on a shadowy hue, deeper than it should have been. I paused for a moment, staring at the water. I could swear the surface was moving in small ripples, even though there was no wind and no one in the pool. It was as though something beneath the water was stirring. Must be the filter, I muttered to myself, trying to ignore the creeping feeling in my chest. I took a few tentative steps toward the pool and dipped a toe into the water. It was cold, colder than it had any right to be. It sent a shiver up my spine, but I ignored it and slid the rest of my body in. The cold water felt like a shock at first, but I quickly got used to it and began to swim laps. As I swam, I felt more and more at ease. The water was calming, despite the strange darkness of the night. The rhythmic sound of my strokes in the water helped clear my mind. But then I heard something. It was faint at first, barely audible above the sound of my breathing and the water sloshing around me. At first I thought it was just the usual creaking of the old pool's structure, but as I swam closer to the deep end, I heard it again. This time, louder. A splash. I stopped mid-stroke and looked around, but there was no one in the pool. The water was still, save for the slight ripples from my movements. I looked up at the lifeguard chair, but the area was empty. The pool was completely silent again, save for the low hum of the pump system. I shrugged it off, convincing myself that it was just a trick of the water or a sound carried on the wind. But the unease didn't leave. I swam a few more laps, but each time I passed the deep end, I felt like something was watching me. A nagging sensation gnawed at the back of my mind, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. Finally, I decided to get out of the water. The pool had become too unsettling, and I just wanted to go home. As I climbed the ladder to the poolside, I noticed something strange. At the far end of the pool, near the diving board, there was a figure. It was a man, tall, with dark hair, dressed in what looked like a dark t-shirt and shorts. He was standing motionless by the diving board, facing away from me. I couldn't see his face, but something about the figure made my stomach drop. It was as if he didn't belong there. "Hey!" I called out, my voice breaking the stillness. "Are you supposed to be here?" The man didn't respond. He just stood there, perfectly still. My heart started to race, and I felt a cold sweat prickling my skin. It wasn't normal for people to be at the pool this late, especially without any other cars in the parking lot. I called out again, louder this time. Still no response. My instincts told me to leave, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from him. I took a few tentative steps closer, and as I did, I noticed something strange. His figure seemed blurry, like it was not entirely there, fading in and out of focus. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, thinking I was seeing things, but when I looked again, he was still there. I froze. The air seemed to thicken, and the temperature around me dropped. The figure began to turn slowly, almost as if it were moving in slow motion. His face came into view, and my blood ran cold. It was pale, almost too pale, with dark, hollow eyes that seemed to bore straight into me. His mouth was twisted into a faint, eerie smile, but there was no warmth to it. He didn't look human. The expression on his face was something out of a nightmare. Before I could react, the figure took a step toward me. Slowly, deliberately. My body went numb with fear. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. All I could do was stare as the man, or whatever he was, moved closer and closer. His feet didn't even touch the ground, his body gliding above the surface like a shadow. I stumbled back, tripping over the ladder and falling to the ground. My mind raced, but my body refused to obey. I could hear a voice in my head screaming at me to run, to get out, but I couldn't. The figure reached the edge of the pool and bent down toward me, his face mere inches from mine. His cold breath brushed across my skin, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread settle in my chest. Then, in an instant, he was gone. The air around me returned to normal, the water in the pool rippling gently as if nothing had ever happened. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. The pool was empty again, just as it had been before. The man, or whatever he was, had disappeared, leaving no trace behind. I didn't wait around to figure out what had happened. I ran as fast as I could out of the pool area, through the gate, and down the street to my house. I didn't look back. I never went back to that pool. No one ever talked about it, not even the other regulars who sometimes swam there after hours. It was as if it had never happened at all. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I can still hear the faint sound of splashing in my mind, and I can never quite shake the image of that pale, twisted face staring at me from the edge of the pool. Story the end.
Story number 7.
I grew up in a small town where everything felt familiar and safe, the kind of place where everyone knew your name and you could leave your door unlocked without worrying. Our local community pool was one of those landmarks that people talked about fondly. It had been there as long as I could remember, with its greenish, slightly murky water, chipped tile edges, and faded blue paint. It wasn't fancy, but for a small town like ours, it was a place where memories were made. Birthday parties, summer camps, teenage hangouts, it was a gathering spot for almost everyone in town. When I was 16, I got my first job as a lifeguard at the pool. It was a simple job, sitting on the high chair watching the swimmers, ensuring that nobody was in danger. The pool wasn't large, just a regular rectangular shape with a shallow end for kids and a deep end that stretched down to about 12 feet. The smell of chlorine was always strong in the air, and it clung to your skin like an invisible reminder of the countless hours spent working there. I was working the evening shift that summer from 4 p.m. to closing at 9. It was usually pretty quiet at that time, especially as the sun started to dip below the trees. Most of the families would leave around 6, and by 7:30 or so, it would be mostly empty. The pool was peaceful at night, with only a few late-night swimmers trying to sneak in some quiet laps. One night, when I was about 2 weeks into the job, something strange happened. It started like any other shift. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pool, and the air smelled thick with the heat of summer. There were only a few kids in the pool, splashing around in the shallow end. The older kids were gathered near the diving board, practicing their cannonballs and flips. I had been scanning the pool for about an hour, making sure everyone was safe and following the rules, when I noticed something odd. A small figure, no older than 8 or 9, was standing at the edge of the deep end, staring down into the water. She was alone, her body facing the dark water below, her legs unmoving. The water was so still that it looked almost glassy, but she stood there as if in a trance, not moving an inch. At first, I thought she was just waiting for someone, or maybe considering whether or not to jump in. I didn't pay much attention to it, assuming she was fine. But as the seconds ticked by, something about her posture felt wrong. She didn't seem like a kid trying to get in the pool. She wasn't dressed for swimming, and she hadn't moved for several minutes. I called out to her, "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help getting in?" She didn't answer. She just kept staring at the water. I began to climb down from my chair, but just before I reached the poolside, I blinked. In that brief second, she was gone, vanished. There was no splash, no noise, no sign of her anywhere in the water. I was confused, but I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was just tired, or perhaps I'd imagined it. But then, over the next few days, I started to notice other strange things. It wasn't just that I'd seen a girl standing by the pool. It was the feeling, the overwhelming sense that something was wrong. The kind of feeling you get when you're not alone, when someone is watching you. I couldn't shake it. I started scanning the pool more intensely, watching for any signs of trouble, but there was nothing until the next week. It was another evening shift, and the pool was nearly empty. The sun had set, and the sky had turned a deep indigo. The street lights along the fence cast long shadows, and the dim overhead lights of the pool created ripples in the water. I sat in my chair, scanning the pool as I always did, when I saw her again. The same little girl standing in the deep end. This time, though, she wasn't just standing there. She was floating just below the surface of the water as if she were weightless. Her hair was long and dark, floating around her head like tendrils. Her eyes were wide open, staring directly at me. But they were not the eyes of a child. They were hollow, distant, empty. I felt a chill run down my spine. I blinked, hoping that it was just a trick of the light, but when I opened my eyes again, she was still there, floating, her face expressionless, her body barely moving in the water. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed with fear, staring at her. My mouth went dry, and I couldn't move. There was no splash, no ripples, no noise. The pool was eerily silent, and I was aware of every single breath I took. It felt like an eternity before she slowly sank deeper into the water, her body disappearing from view. I immediately jumped down from my chair and rushed to the edge of the pool. I leaned over trying to see her, but the water was dark and opaque. There was no sign of anyone in the deep end. I felt foolish for having hesitated, and I quickly made my way around the pool, checking every corner. But I found nothing. When I told my supervisor, Jamie, about what had happened, she just laughed it off. "It's probably just a reflection or some weird play of the light," she said, shrugging. "There's nothing to worry about." But the unease never left me. The following days were spent in a haze of constant vigilance. I found myself checking the deep end constantly, my heart racing whenever I noticed movement in the water. I couldn't focus on anything else. The image of that little girl's hollow eyes haunted me, lingering in my mind. The next weekend, I was working a Saturday shift when it happened again. This time, the pool was almost completely empty, save for a few regulars swimming their laps. It was around 8 p.m., and the temperature had dropped a little, but it was still warm enough to swim. I was sitting in my chair when I saw her once more, standing at the far end of the pool, just as she had been before. Only this time, something was different. She was not standing still. She was moving. Slowly, deliberately, she began to walk toward the shallow end, her wet feet making no sound against the tiles. She was almost at the edge when I jumped down from my chair and rushed to her. "Hey, are you all right?" I called to her, my voice trembling. She stopped, her head tilting slightly as if she were listening to something I couldn't hear. I reached out to touch her shoulder, but before my hand could make contact, she disappeared. I stumbled back, breathless, and looked around the pool area. The water was still, the empty chairs were silent, the faint smell of chlorine hung in the air, but there was no sign of the girl. I ran inside to the staff room, my pulse pounding in my ears. I told Jamie what had happened, and again she brushed it off. But I could tell something was wrong with me. I was on edge, my nerves frayed. The next day I asked one of the older lifeguards, Frank, if he knew anything about the girl. He looked at me for a long time, then hesitated. "You've seen her, haven't you?" I nodded, unsure what to say. "She's been around for years," Frank said softly. "I've seen her too, and I've heard stories." He told me that years ago, before the pool had been renovated, there had been a tragic drowning. A young girl, about 8 or 9 years old, had slipped into the deep end. Her body was found hours later, but by then it was too late. "They never talked much about it," Frank said, his voice low. "But there were rumors. People said her ghost would appear at the pool from time to time, especially on warm nights, that she was trapped, still waiting for someone to help her." The more Frank spoke, the more I realized that what I was experiencing wasn't just a trick of the light. Something was haunting that pool. That night, I stayed late, determined to get to the bottom of it. I didn't know what I was expecting, but as the darkness settled in and the pool grew silent, I could feel her presence. The chill in the air was palpable, the silence oppressive. And then, just as I had feared, I saw her again. She was standing in the deep end, her hair floating around her face, her eyes locked on mine. But this time, she wasn't just standing. She was walking toward me, slowly, the water parting around her feet. I knew then that I couldn't stay there anymore. I quit the next morning, and I never returned to that pool again. I heard later that they had closed the pool for good, citing structural issues and safety concerns. But I know the truth. Some places are haunted by the past. Some spirits never move on. Story the end.
Story number 8.
I grew up in a small town with a population just under 10,000 people. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone and not much changed over the years. The most exciting thing we had was our community pool, a rectangular, slightly faded structure that had been built decades ago. For as long as I could remember, the pool was the heart of the neighborhood during summer. My friends and I would spend hours there, swimming, diving, and just enjoying the heat of the day. But as I got older, I started to notice things. Strange things. I never told anyone about it, at least not for a long time. I wasn't sure anyone would believe me, and I didn't even fully understand it myself until much later. It started when I was about 16. The pool was one of those places that had a lifeguard on duty during the day, but after hours, it was usually left open for anyone to use. Not many people knew about it, but it was a common secret among the teenagers. If you wanted to swim after the lifeguard left, you could, but it was at your own risk. Sometimes people would sneak in after dark, and though we weren't supposed to, there was an unspoken rule that if you were quiet and didn't disturb anyone, you could have the place to yourself. I was one of those people. I worked at a local diner in the evenings, and after my shift ended at 10 p.m., I would often walk over to the pool to cool off. The streets were quiet, and the pool area was usually deserted by then. It was peaceful, and I loved the solitude. It felt like a secret place of my own. On one of those late-night swims, something happened that I couldn't explain. I had been swimming for about an hour, just floating on my back and staring up at the stars. The pool was eerily silent, save for the occasional ripple of water when I moved. It was the perfect kind of night, cool enough to be comfortable, with a soft breeze that made the still air feel almost alive. The moonlight was reflected in the water, casting a silvery glow across the surface. I had just turned over to swim another lap when I heard it. At first, it was faint, a soft splashing sound like someone was paddling just beneath the surface of the water. I paused, treading water, and listened. There was no one else around. I was alone. The pool was always empty after hours. The sound continued, faint at first, but then it grew louder, closer. I turned toward the deep end of the pool. The water looked darker over there, and I couldn't make out much in the dim light. But I could hear it now. Someone was definitely in the water, moving slowly, almost deliberately. My heart started to race. I didn't know if someone had snuck in after me or if I was just hearing things, but I could have sworn I wasn't alone anymore. I called out, half expecting someone to answer, but no reply came. The sound of splashing grew louder, closer. At this point, I was panicking, trying to figure out where the person was, but I still couldn't see anyone. I swam toward the deep end, scanning the water, but it remained eerily still. I reached the edge and looked around, expecting to see someone emerge, but there was nothing. No one. My hands were shaking. I was still in the water, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air around me felt heavier, colder. I glanced back at the shallow end and saw something that made my stomach drop, a shadow, barely noticeable, moving across the deck near the locker rooms. It was a fleeting glimpse, but I could have sworn it was there. I quickly swam back toward the shallow end, my heart pounding. As I reached the steps to climb out of the pool, I heard a voice, a whisper, almost like a breath. It was so faint I almost thought I imagined it, but it felt like someone was right behind me. I spun around in the water, but there was no one. The pool was empty. I pulled myself out of the water, my body trembling, and ran to the locker room, not looking back. I dressed quickly, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I could feel the cold sweat on my skin as I left the locker room, my mind still reeling from the strange noises. I didn't know what to make of it. Was I just tired? Had I imagined the whole thing? The next day, I returned to the pool. I wasn't sure why. Maybe I thought I could shake off the fear, but I had to know if something had been there. I walked around the pool, inspecting the area. The gate was locked, the fence was intact. There were no signs of anyone having broken in. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I wasn't the only one who had been there the night before. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't shake the unease. Every time I swam at night, I kept hearing the splashing, the soft whispers. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of a shadow out of the corner of my eye. Other times I'd hear footsteps walking around the pool, but when I looked, there was no one. It was as if I was being watched. I'd swim faster, get out of the water sooner, but each time the sense of dread would follow me home. One night, I decided to bring a friend with me. Her name was Emily, and she worked at the diner with me. I told her I was nervous about something at the pool, and she agreed to come with me, though she wasn't exactly thrilled. We got there just after the lifeguard left, and I remember feeling a little more at ease with someone else there. We swam for a while, chatting and laughing, but soon enough, the mood changed. The first sign that something was wrong came when Emily stopped swimming. She was in the shallow end, and I had just completed a lap when I noticed her staring at something in the water. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. I swam over to her. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice tight with anxiety. I saw something," she whispered, her voice trembling. "In the water. It was like a face, just for a second, but I saw it. There was a face in the water." I looked around, but the pool was still as it always was. There was no sign of a face or anything unusual. I tried to reassure her, but she wouldn't stop staring at the water, her body frozen in place. I tried to get her to leave, but she refused, so we swam a little longer, both of us uncomfortable now. The strange feeling I'd been carrying for weeks was growing stronger. That's when we heard it, clearer than ever. A splash, then another. It was coming from the deep end. We both turned, but this time, we could see something in the water. A shadow, slowly moving beneath the surface. We both froze, unable to move, watching the figure as it glided silently through the water. It was a person, but not a person. The way it moved was wrong, unnatural. It was as though it wasn't really swimming at all, but floating just beneath the surface, its limbs twisting at impossible angles. Without thinking, I grabbed Emily's arm and pulled her toward the shallow end. We scrambled out of the pool, our hearts racing. I glanced over my shoulder once before I climbed over the edge. I could have sworn I saw something looking up at us from the deep end, something pale with hollow eyes and a twisted grin on its face. We didn't go back to the pool after that. We didn't talk about it much, either. But I know what I saw. I know what Emily saw. And I still feel the weight of it sometimes. The sound of splashing water, the whisper in the dark. The pool was eventually drained and closed for repairs the following year. They said it was due to some structural damage. But I've always wondered if they knew something more. If there was something in the water that they couldn't explain. Sometimes, when I drive by the pool now, I catch a glimpse of the empty, overgrown area, and I feel that same uneasy chill down my spine. I've never gone back, and I don't think I ever will. Story the end.
Story number 9.
I always thought I was immune to the supernatural. I'd grown up hearing ghost stories at sleepovers and watching late-night horror flicks, but I'd never had a single thing happen to me that couldn't be explained by simple logic or natural occurrences. That was until I worked at the local community pool. I never imagined that a summer job cleaning and maintaining the pool would change my perspective on the world so dramatically. The job itself wasn't anything special. I was hired as an overnight cleaner for the local public pool. The pool closed at 9 p.m., and my shift was from 9:30 p.m. to midnight, giving me plenty of time to mop the floors, skim the water, and scrub down the locker rooms. It wasn't glamorous work, but the pay was decent for a college student, and I needed the money. I'd been working the night shift for a few weeks, and while the pool had a slightly eerie feeling when the lights were dimmed and the water sat still, nothing out of the ordinary had happened. I'd spend the first few hours alone in the locker rooms, cleaning the showers and mopping the floors, while the sound of the water's filtration system hummed in the background. It was a rhythm I became accustomed to, calm and predictable. That was until one night when something happened that I couldn't explain away, something that would make me question everything I thought I knew about the world. It was a Thursday evening, and I had just clocked in for my usual shift. The pool had closed for the night, and the building was quiet, except for the buzzing of the overhead lights. I'd always appreciated the silence after hours. The day had been hot, and the pool had been busy, so the quiet after the final swimmers left felt almost soothing. I did my usual rounds, checking the bathrooms, cleaning the locker rooms, and preparing to skim the pool. I wasn't particularly tired that night, but something in the air felt different, like the building was holding its breath. I shrugged it off and carried on with my work. When I finally made my way out to the pool deck to start skimming, that's when I first noticed it. The pool lights were flickering. This wasn't unusual. Sometimes the lights would blink and fade before coming back on, but this time it seemed off. The lights dimmed to an unnatural level before flickering back to full brightness. I stood by the edge of the pool, looking at the water, waiting for the lights to settle. I checked the circuit breakers, but everything appeared to be normal. I turned the lights back on and continued with my duties, but the strange feeling of unease crept in. It was almost as if the atmosphere around me had changed. I grabbed the pool skimmer, walked to the edge, and dipped it into the water. That's when I saw it. A shape. It wasn't large, but it was there. The water rippled in a way that made it hard to discern exactly what it was, but there was something in the pool. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. I paused, staring at the dark water. I thought for a moment that it was just the reflection of one of the pool lights, but no, this shape was moving. Slowly. I leaned closer to the edge, squinting into the water. I could see it more clearly now. Just below the surface, a pale figure seemed to be floating, its body motionless, almost suspended. The water around it seemed to swirl in unnatural patterns, as though the figure was causing the movement. I called out, my voice shaking slightly. "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I stepped closer, shining my flashlight toward the water. The beam caught something, just for a moment. It was a face. A pale face, with dark hair floating around it, eyes wide open, staring up at me from the depths. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the skimmer. My heart pounded in my chest as I quickly looked around the pool deck, but there was no one else in sight. The pool was empty. I was alone. I stood there frozen, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. I took a few steps back, my breath shallow, my hands trembling. I couldn't deny what I just witnessed, but I couldn't understand it either. Get a grip, I told myself. It's just the light playing tricks on you. It's nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling. It was as if something was watching me, waiting for me to do something. The unease settled in the pit of my stomach, and for the first time I regretted taking the job. I decided to finish my shift and leave early, but as I turned to head for the exit, I heard it. A splash. It was faint at first, just a small ripple in the water. I froze, turning slowly back to the pool. The figure was gone, but I could see the water moving. Something or someone was still in the pool. My eyes darted around the pool deck, trying to find the source of the sound. Another splash. This time it was louder, unmistakable. The ripples in the water grew larger, as if something was swimming just beneath the surface. "Hello?" I called out again, my voice wavering. "Who's there?" No response. I felt an icy chill spread through me, and I backed away from the pool, my mind racing. I'd heard stories from the other staff members about the pool being haunted. They said it was just rumors, nothing more. But I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I quickly grabbed my things and made my way to the exit, but as I walked past the pool one last time, I saw it again. A shadow moving in the water. It was unmistakable now. A figure, no longer floating, was moving through the pool, slowly circling the deep end. My heart raced as I looked around. The doors were locked, and I was alone. The building was empty. There was no one in the pool, yet I could see the figure as clear as day, the water moving with its every movement. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran out of the building, my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't stop until I was outside in the cool night air, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My mind couldn't process what I had just seen. I felt sick, disoriented, like I was still trapped in that nightmare. The next morning, I called in sick and didn't go back for my shift. I didn't want to admit it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been in the pool with me that night. Something that didn't belong there. Something that had been watching me. That's when I learned the truth. I spoke with one of the other lifeguards, a woman named Sarah, who had been working at the pool for years. She told me about the girl. A long time ago, a young swimmer had drowned in the deep end during a practice. The girl had been a strong swimmer, but she had misjudged her turn and got caught in the drain. The lifeguard on duty that night hadn't been able to get to her in time. They pulled her out of the water, but it was too late. Since then, there had been rumors. Strange things, footsteps in the empty locker rooms, whispers in the dead of night, and of course, the ghost in the pool. Some of the night staff had seen her, floating just below the surface, staring up at them with empty eyes. The water had always been her domain. I never went back to that pool again. The thought of being alone in that empty, cold building, surrounded by the murky water and the echoes of a life lost, was too much for me to handle. The summer job that had seemed so simple became a permanent scar in my memory. To this day, I still hear the faintest sound of water splashing, even when I'm nowhere near a pool. Sometimes, late at night, I catch myself staring into the dark, wondering if I'm being watched. And every time I hear the sound of water, whether in the distance or in my dreams, it makes my skin crawl. Story, the end.
Story number 10.
It started with the pool party. That's when I first noticed it. At the time, I was just another teenager looking for a good time with friends on a hot summer's evening. The community pool was the go-to place during the season, especially for the local high school kids. We'd spend hours swimming, lounging, or trying to impress one another with cannonballs and flips off the diving board. This particular night, however, was different. Something felt off from the beginning. The pool had always had an almost nostalgic quality to it, a relic of summers past. It wasn't particularly large, just an old-fashioned rectangular shape with the deep end that had always felt ominous to me, even when I was younger. The tile on the poolside was cracked in places. The blue paint on the walls faded from years of exposure to the sun. The chlorinated water always had that distinct, sharp smell that made the air feel thick. Despite all this, it had been a fixture in our town for as long as I could remember, a place where kids spent hours in the water and families gathered to celebrate the heat. That evening, the party was in full swing. People were talking, laughing and swimming in the warm water as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the pool area. My friends and I were lounging on the deck, chatting and joking around when I saw her. She was standing by the deep end near the diving board, staring at the water. She couldn't have been more than 10 or 11 years old, wearing a faded pink swimsuit and a sun hat, her long hair draped over her shoulders in loose curls. There was something strangely still about her, something that caught my attention in the middle of the busy party. I had been talking to one of my friends when I first saw her, so I thought nothing of it at first. But as time passed, I couldn't shake the image of the girl standing at the pool's edge. She didn't seem to move at all, not even as the other kids splashed around her. She was simply there, staring into the water, as though she was lost in her thoughts, or something else entirely. I pointed her out to my friend, but when we both looked back, she was gone. There was no sign of her at all. Probably just a kid from the neighborhood, my friend said, brushing it off, but the odd feeling in my chest remained. I tried to dismiss it, thinking maybe I had imagined the girl or confused her for someone else. It wasn't unheard of for kids to come to the pool without their parents, after all. Still, I felt uneasy. Later that evening, as the pool party began to wind down and people started packing up, I found myself lingering by the water, my eyes darting toward the deep end. The lights above the pool cast a faint glow on the water's surface, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving beneath the water's stillness. I blinked, trying to focus, but the ripples that had caught my eye faded quickly, and I told myself it was nothing. The unease I had felt earlier only seemed to grow stronger, though. It wasn't just the girl. It was something else, something I couldn't explain. I couldn't shake the feeling that the pool itself was watching me, that something was lurking beneath its surface. It was the next day that I learned about the history of the pool, and that's when things really started to get strange. I had gone to the pool with a few friends to swim, just to kill time on a hot afternoon. While we were hanging out by the shallow end, one of the older lifeguards, a guy named Dave, was sitting in his chair, watching us all with an air of disinterest. He'd worked there for years, and his aloof attitude didn't seem to change much. As we chatted, I noticed an older man sitting near the pool's edge, talking to Dave. He looked familiar, but I couldn't place where I'd seen him before. After a few minutes, I overheard them talking about the pool's history. I leaned in, curious, trying to catch a few snippets of their conversation. Used to be more families, you know, back when the town was more tight-knit. Yeah, Dave responded. I've heard the stories. The drowning. The man's voice dropped, as if speaking about something he wasn't entirely sure of. It was decades ago, but people still talk about her. You think the stories are true? Dave didn't answer right away. He looked around the pool as if searching for something before shaking his head. I don't know, but some of the old-timers swear they see her sometimes, the little girl. At this point, my curiosity had fully peaked. I slipped closer, hoping to hear more. The man continued, his voice barely above a whisper. She drowned here back in the 60s. Some say it was an accident, but others say it wasn't. They say she was playing around the diving board and, well, something happened. She didn't make it out. I felt a shiver run down my spine. A drowning. It wasn't unusual for a pool to have such a story attached to it, but this felt different. The air felt heavier as I listened. Some people say you can still see her, the older man added, his voice shaking slightly. Standing at the edge, staring at the water. Some say they've heard her voice, calling out for help. I didn't know what to think. It felt like a typical ghost story, one that old-timers like to share to spook the younger generation. But there was something about the way they were speaking, the way Dave's gaze shifted nervously, that made me doubt it was just a tale. Something about it felt real. And then I remembered the girl I had seen the night before. I tried to push the thought out of my mind, but it lingered. Over the next few days, the unease I had been feeling about the pool intensified. Every time I walked near the deep end, I felt as though someone was watching me. I would glance over my shoulder, certain that I could see a figure standing near the edge, but whenever I looked, no one was there. One evening, a week after the party, I was at the pool alone. It was late, and the place was nearly empty. I had stayed late to finish a swim, and the night had settled in. The lights around the pool flickered as I swam laps in the deep end. I could hear the faint echo of my own movements in the water, the rhythmic sound of my strokes. But then something strange happened. I felt the water shift. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but the sensation intensified. It was as though something, or someone, was moving just below the surface, disturbing the otherwise calm water. I froze in place, my heart suddenly racing. My breathing quickened as I looked around the deep end, but I couldn't see anything. I slowly swam toward the shallow end, my mind racing. It felt as if something was lurking just out of sight, something waiting in the dark corners of the pool. I pushed myself to the ladder and quickly climbed out of the water, feeling cold despite the warmth of the evening air. As I stood by the edge, trying to calm my nerves, I heard a soft voice. It was faint, barely a whisper, but it came from the water. It was a child's voice, so soft, so far away. "Help me." My blood ran cold. I didn't think twice. I ran out of the pool area, my feet pounding against the concrete, my heart racing in my chest. I didn't stop until I was safely inside my car, staring back at the pool in the distance. That was the last time I ever went back to that pool. I tried to tell my friends about what had happened, but they all dismissed it as just a bad experience, maybe a trick of the mind. But I knew what I heard. I knew what I felt. The little girl from the stories, the one who drowned all those years ago, was still there, waiting. Months later, I heard from a friend who worked at the pool that it had been closed down for good. There were no official explanations, just that they were renovating it. I never found out the full story, but I don't think I need to. Some places are haunted, not by the past, but by what's left behind when the past refuses to let go. Story the end.